Hi, Stephen.
Oh, here's someone who knows something.
Hi, Jay.
I better
Hi,
keep quiet.
David. How are you? Thank you for a spirited debate thus far. Just had one question. So, David and Jay, I presume you have a lot of friends on the liberal side of the aisle, as they say, and you spend a lot of time in those circles and in Washington, New York, across the nation. What do you think is the most problematic or disturbing trend in their thoughts and in their sort of vision of where this country is today? In other words, what do you think is the liberals' biggest problem today?
I'll say quickly something I've thought since childhood. I think just about the worst thing about this country is its racial hang-ups. And we have them for reasons we can all understand and explain. But I think this country is race-obsessed, has race on the brain, and that we could all use some relief from race. This is why I was battered by this when I was a kid. It was just constant black and white, constant black and white. People couldn't be people, they couldn't be men and women, they couldn't be Americans, they couldn't be sons and daughters of God. They had to be races and ethnicities. And if I had one prayer or wish for this country, it would be to heal itself of some of this racial obsession and look at people as people, good and bad, and not as skin colors and ethnicities. What's the black, white, or Hispanic position on missile defense? Or on marginal tax rates? Charlie Rangel, when he was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, said tax cuts were racist. Well, thank you very much. I think we would all, while not being naive and having heads in sand, I think we could benefit from a little less focus on race and try to achieve some sort of transcendence of race. I think that would do us a world of good. It would make the country a less it's a jarring and bruising place to live in my view.
I guess on that, I think it's too easy for somebody in the majority culture like us to say that when people in the minority cultures feel it's important, and we should respect at least their interest in that subject.
And David, I'm mainly talking about white liberals.
Okay, well, I'm
Danilo was asking about people on the other side of the aisle, and that's the question I addressed.
Okay. Now, I guess my subject would be, first, I find most of the liberals I know in Washington have much more faith in central planning than I do. That if you get 12 smart people around the room, they can reorganize the Medicare system. And second, I think the most immediate problem is the hostility towards serious reform of entitlements. Medicare, you pay in over the course, a couple pays in over the course, there are many ways to calculate this, but a couple pays in over the course of their lifetime about $133,000 into the Medicare system. They take out in benefits something like $450,000. It's something like 3 or 4 to 1. That's just not a sustainable system. And it doesn't do good to do what Obama has done, which is to tamp down the reimbursement rates, because you just create perverse incentives as people try to make up the revenue in other ways. You have to fundamentally restore the system. You have to fundamentally restructure it to get rid of the fee-for-service system, which is the perverse incentives at the root of the whole problem. And so to me, the problem with the Democratic Party now is that it is unwilling to do that fundamental problem, so that in 9 years, interest on the debt payments will be about $800 billion a year, big in the defense budget. And we're imposing these horrific costs on the future generations, and the squeeze is such we do not have the money to spend on the issues like the coming apart issue. So I would fix it just very practically on entitlements.
Great. I guess maybe first of all, thank you. But to pull a few strings together, I was struck by the response of Kirkpatrick to Buckley that you brought up, Mr. Nordlinger. Because to me, it seems like part of conservatism is fairness and community in particular, right? I think that,
sure,
as was just alluded to, you need these communities, right? De Tocqueville talks about, these like small American communities that make it great. And, I guess Putnam shows us that they're dissolving now, except at least with bowling. And so I guess I'm interested in two aspects. And one is, how do we repackage the Conservative Party? Because I feel like this libertarian strain is what people focus on, right? But if you're trying to fix things, no one does it alone, right? And you need to have these types of communities. So how do you reintroduce communities so that conservatives can take it back, right? The packaging works for the other side because, as Mr. Brooks has pointed out, no one is born, by themselves, right? The ethics needs the politics to have a complete whole. And so given that, I think I'm interested in how we can reappropriate those terms to kind of show that while libertarianism is important, you certainly need the Bill of Rights. You also need a community and you need a society in which to have that. And I guess below that is how on the ground can you start to affect some of these changes, right? So George Will points out the fact that we're losing, the families and issues like that. But then I guess not only in terms of family, but in terms of, I think, schools and issues like that, it seems as though schools would be the ideal conservative meritocratic system that one should promote. And I mean, if in a democracy one needs to be educated in order to be able to cast a vote, it would seem. And so I guess I'm wondering, what are the issues that conservatives can start to take back such that one can enter into a democratic system as an individual, at the same time realizing that one's part of a community inextricably, and I think for their own benefit?
Well, there are a lot of successful conservative politicians, aren't there? People who've been elected to the House and the Senate and the governorships and the state legislatures and so on. So they obviously have some connection to the voters. And maybe some of the more successful politicians should be imitated. Of course, it just depends on the constituency you're working with. But conservatives have been much better at getting elected over the last 30 years or so than they were before. And conservatives, Taft-style conservatives, were curiosities in a great many places. Why the education issue isn't more saleable? That is a melancholy topic, in my view. I think I quoted a colleague earlier. If people wanted better schools, we would have them. Schools are a little like Congress. People say that schools generally are bad, but they like theirs. People say they can't stand Congress, but they happen to like their congressman. And why hasn't school choice taken off as a civil rights issue? Why hasn't an end to race preferences taken off as a civil rights issue? Ward Connerly names his outfit the American Civil Rights Institute, I think. These, to me, are very melancholy questions. I think school choice fails time after time because it requires caring about other people's children, children we never meet. And I must say, it does the Republican Party no good politically. The only reason to do it is because it's the right thing to do. I have personal friends, David has the same friends, who have spent millions of their own dollars, and they could have had extra houses in the Bahamas and Gstaad and so on, poured into school choice. And often they're not thanked. Quite the people like Dusty Rhodes and Dick Gilder and Ginny Gilder, they spend millions of their own money. Barack Obama, he pledges to repeal the DC school choice program, DC scholarship program, as soon as he's president. Tells the teachers' unions, we're not going to have that anymore. And he was going to stand in the way of the schoolhouse door and shut that thing down. And he was true to his word, he did. And no one cared. No one. And what to do about that, I don't know. But there are, to repeat myself, there are plenty of successful conservative politicians. So it's not like the words allude to them. And there are new ones all the while, so-called rising stars.
Yes, I think there are fewer successful conservative politicians. Republicans have lost the popular vote in 5 out of the last 6 elections. The current favorability ratings of the two parties is 47 for the Democrats and 22 or so for the Republicans. That's not so good. The Republicans would have lost the House if not for redistricting, probably. And so I think the political situation is a little more dire. Well, there are rising stars, Marco Rubio and people like that are deeply impressive people. As far as community building, let me start with that school choice issue. I used to be a believer in school choice until I just read the studies where it's tried out. The studies are disappointing. The results are just not so good. The school choice issue appeals because it seems like a market-based emphasis on personal freedom and choice. But the evidence just hasn't been there. And so I think where the evidence leads us is that we can talk about reshuffling the bureaucratic boxes of schools, of charters or vouchers or this or that. But the elemental fact is that education is about the emotional relationship between a teacher and a student. And if you're ignoring that relationship, you're ignoring the elemental fact of education. And the distinction between public and private choice and vouchers is not the crucial distinction compared to getting the qualified teacher in the room. And so that, to me, is where the evidence leads. And that leads to a different style of governing and thinking, which is not a market-based style, let's make everything into as much of a market opportunity as possible, but a relational style. And if you focus on the nature of relationships between a teacher and a student, between a neighborhood and a child, between parents and each other, then I think you're in a different mode. And so one of the things I would do, which is something John McCain actually talked about, I'm not sure he could have get it passed, was one of the reasons we have this expansion of single parenthood is because a lot of men just aren't marriageable. They're just not worth marrying because they don't have solid careers. And so working on some of those training programs and even some EITC and wage subsidies to give people regular incomes so a sensible woman wants to marry these guys. To me, that's the sort of community building that actually needs to be done.
David, think about that elemental teacher-student relationship. It can't begin, teaching can't begin until there's peace in the classroom, until there's an end to violence and fear. And a lot of these kids, as you well know, are trapped in these violent schools where learning is not really the question, it's just how am I going to get through the day? And their parents have no choice at all. Unlike what? None. They're just trapped there. And I have a dear friend who's a teacher in Harlem. And she says if there's any teaching going on, it's just gravy. How do you get through the day without incidents that are simply too grave? How can you maintain some sort of order? Kids can't learn in a disordered or violent or fearful environment. And so I love what you said about the teacher-student relationship. I certainly had it. But I was lucky enough to go to public schools that were where one could learn something and where teachers could teach something.
Good. Well, good. Thank you, Love. I just want to say before we end, because I want to put my own 2 cents in here for what I think a serious conservative needs to know, and disappointingly, whose names did not appear from either of you. I'd just like to say before I go, and this may reflect my own generation, I think, but a serious conservative coming in college has to read Ed Banfield's book, The Unheavenly City, perhaps the most important book, it sounds funny for a conservative, but about urban politics ever written. You have to read, I would say, anything by James Q. Wilson, but let me just recommend his book, The Moral Sense, which is a magnificent book and the best kind of blend of social science and moral philosophy. And I was surprised also not to hear the name of Michael Oakeshott, the only great political philosopher of the 20th century who actually called himself a conservative. His essay on being conservative is perhaps the smartest thing ever written about the sort of conservative disposition, and that none of their names were mentioned. So I want to do that.
I want to apologize. You're in the business of building curricula. We're not.
I know. Well, we all do what we can do, right? I mean, we all do what we can do. But I want to thank both of you, David and Jay, for really a wonderful and stimulating contribution to this great William F. Buckley program. You've done it proud. Thank you so much.